My name is Marco Reyes, and the first thing they told me about the third floor was that the patients sleep well there, better than anywhere else in the building, and I believed them. Right up until the night, I understood why. I am a licensed practical nurse. Have been for 6 years. You move between rooms. You check lines and vitals and fluid levels. You write things down. You wash your hands so many times in a single shift that the skin on your knuckles starts to crack by winter. And you keep a small tube of unscented lotion in your left scrub pocket because scented ones bother certain patients, and you learn that early or you learn it the hard way. That is the job. That is most of it. The facility is called Harrifield Convalescent and Long-Term Care. It sits on the northwest edge of Portage Park, Chicago, a converted brick building from the 1940s, 3 floors, 22 beds total, 6 of which are on the 3rd floor where I worked. Night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The kind of hours that turn your sleep schedule into something you stop explaining to people because the explanation takes longer than the sympathy it produces. The fire escape on the east side was original. Painted over so many times the rivets have become part of the paint, the whole thing fused into a single rusted form that the facility's manager told me, when I asked, had been inspected and cleared. I stopped asking about the east side of the building after a while. The 3rd floor had its own rhythm. 6 patients, all long-term, most of them past the point where anyone expected significant change. My job was to keep them stable. Rounds every hour, vitals at midnight and 4 a.m., log entries at the top and bottom of each hour. The physical work of it was straightforward. Check the lines, check the monitors, write the time, move to the next room. What your hands actually do on a shift like that, you uncap and recap things. You adjust pillows, you initial forms. You roll a blood pressure cuff onto an arm that does not fully register you are there, and you wait for the number, and you write the number down. You do this 6 times an hour. You do it in the dark mostly, with a pen light clipped to your chest pocket, because the overhead lights disturb the patients, and there is a specific quality to waking someone at 2 in the morning in a long-term care facility that stays with you. The confusion on their face, the few seconds where they don't know what year it is, and you learn to avoid it when you can. The corridors smelled like disinfectant over the specific mineral dryness of old plaster. The smell of walls that have absorbed 40 years of winter heat and have no intention of giving it back. Something faintly stronger near the east end that I eventually stopped noticing, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you live near a highway. I told myself it was the pipes. Old buildings have old pipes. That is a thing that is true. I took the job because I owed $14,000 and change to 3 different creditors, and because the man who hired me, a facility director named Pruitt, did not call Northwestern for reference. That second part matters more than it sounds. I had worked at Northwestern Memorial for 2 years before Harrifield. Good hospital, good unit, the kind of place that looks right on a resume and feels right when you tell people where you work at family dinners. I left, or was asked to leave, depending on how you want to frame it, after a medication error on my floor. A patient received the wrong dosage of a blood thinner, not a fatal error. The patient recovered. The investigation cleared me on paper, meaning my name was not on the order and my initials were not on the bag. But I was the nurse who walked past that bag 3 times during the shift and did not catch it. I knew the patient's chart. I knew her history. I should have seen it. The board cleared me. My own head did not. I resigned 2 weeks after the investigation closed because I could not walk that floor anymore without doing the math on every bag I passed. And a nurse who is doing that math is slower than a nurse who isn't, and slower gets people hurt. So I left. And then I was a nurse with a gap on his resume and no reference from his last employer and $14,000 spread across 2 credit cards and a personal loan he took out when the gap stretched from 6 weeks to 4 months. Pruitt posted the listing on 3 different job boards with no company name, just an address and a shift time and an hourly rate that was $2 above market. I called the number. He asked me 2 questions. Did I have a current LPN license? And could I start Thursday? I said yes to both. He did not ask about Northwestern. I have a habit, had it since I was a kid, actually something my mother used to do in her kitchen when she was anxious, counting the tiles on the backsplash while she waited for water to boil. I picked it up from her without noticing. When I'm nervous, I count things. Steps between 2 points. Ceiling panels. The number of times a monitor beeps before the next one. It is not something I do on purpose. It is something I notice myself doing after the fact, the way you notice you've been holding your breath. I mention it only because it is the kind of detail that seems like nothing when you first hear it. Most details do. I drove to Harrahfield on a Thursday in October, parked on the street because the lot was staff only and I did not yet have a pass, and stood outside the building for about 90 seconds looking at it before I went in. It was not a dramatic moment. I was not filled with dread. I was filled with the specific flatness of a person who needs a paycheck and has stopped requiring the work to be anything more than that. The drive from my apartment in Logan Square took 19 minutes at that hour. No traffic on Kimball after 10. I would come to know that drive the way you know a route you stop thinking about. The left on Addison, the light at Central that always ran long, the parking spot on the side street that was almost always open because it was directly under a broken street lamp, and people avoided it without knowing why. I took it every time. The dark didn't bother me. I had worked nights long enough that darkness felt like the neutral state of things and daylight was the interruption. Harrahfield looked different at night than it did the afternoon I interviewed. In daylight, it was just an old brick building with replacement windows that didn't quite match the original frames. The kind of renovation that solves the practical problem and creates an aesthetic one. At night, the brick went almost black, and the windows on the third floor caught the light from the street in a way that made them look occupied, even when I knew the patients were asleep. I noticed it on my first real shift, and I noticed it every shift after. It is the kind of thing you file under the building has character and move on. The front entrance used a key card after 9 p.m. The lobby had 2 chairs, a reception desk that was unmanned on nights, and an elevator that made a sound on the way up. Not a mechanical sound exactly, more like the building itself adjusting to the weight of you. A low shift somewhere in the shaft that you felt more in your sternum than heard with your ears. The third floor corridor ran straight from the elevator to a fire door at the far east end, with a nurse's station at the midpoint and 3 patient rooms on each side. The floors were the original tile, a green glaze, the kind that had been mopped so many times the grout had gone gray, and they reflected the overhead lighting back up at you in a way that made the corridor look slightly wet even when it was dry. I wore soft-soled shoes like most nurses do, and my footsteps were quiet, but quiet in that corridor had a specific quality. It was not the quiet of an empty space. It was the quiet of a space where things were present, but not moving. 6 patients behind 6 doors, monitors humming, the occasional shift of a body in a bed. Occupied quiet. That is the only way I know to describe it. The nurse's station was a half-moon desk with 2 monitors, a phone, a logbook, a binder with a blue cover, and a chair that leaned slightly to the left and made a sound when you shifted your weight that I eventually learned to account for without thinking. Behind the desk, a short hallway led to a supply room and a staff bathroom. The supply room smelled like every supply room, latex and plastic, and the particular sharpness of individually wrapped alcohol swabs. The staff bathroom had a light that took 10 seconds to warm up, fluorescent, the kind that hums at a frequency you only notice when everything else is silent. The east corridor, the stretch between the last pair of rooms and the fire door, was maybe 30 feet long. It had 4 overhead lights, evenly spaced, and a ventilation panel on the right side wall about 2/3 of the way down. The last light, the one closest to the fire door, was off on my first night. I noted it and assumed the bulb had gone. The floor tile down that end was the same green as the rest, but the grout there had gone darker than elsewhere, almost black in the gaps, and the mineral smell I had noticed on my first visit was stronger there. Not strong enough to stop you, strong enough to notice once, and then categorize and file away. I counted the wall panels on that east stretch on my first round without meaning to. It is a wide corridor. The panels are evenly spaced, and my brain does what it does. 8 panels on the left side, floor to ceiling, the same beadboard-style wainscoting that ran the length of the whole floor. I noted the number the way I note most things, automatically, without assigning it meaning. 8. I moved on. I checked the fire door was latched. I came back up the corridor toward the station. The last light was still off. The smell faded as I walked back toward the midpoint. By the time I reached the station, it was gone entirely, and I had already stopped thinking about it. What I had not stopped thinking about was the logbook entry from the prior shift. 6 patients initialed, all present, all stable, and then one final entry at the bottom of the page, added after the shift end signature, in handwriting slightly different from the rest. It said 7/440, nothing else. I assumed it was a typo. Old logbooks accumulate typos. People are tired at the end of night shift, and their handwriting gets loose, and numbers look like other numbers. I closed the logbook and set it aside and waited for my orientation to begin. Her name was Rin Okafor. She was in her late 50s, close-cut gray hair, and she had a habit when she spoke to you of placing both hands flat on the desk in front of her, palms down, fingers spread, like she was showing you she wasn't holding anything. I noticed it the first time she did it, and I noticed it every time after. It was not a nervous gesture. It was the opposite of a nervous gesture. It was the gesture of someone who had decided, at some point, that stillness was the correct response to most situations, and had practiced it until it became automatic. She had worked the 3rd floor for 11 years. She told me, this the way you tell someone the make of your car. A fact, useful for context, not a source of pride or complaint. 11 years on the same floor, same shift, same 6 rooms. I did the math later and did not say out loud. She knew every patient by name and by the specific sounds they made at night. Which ones shifted at 2 a.m., which ones would have their eyes open at rounds without being awake in any meaningful sense, which monitors ran slightly high and which ran slightly low, and how much variation was the machine versus the patient. She knew the floor the way a person knows a place they have decided to stay in despite having reasons to leave. She trained me without warmth and without coldness. She showed me the supply room, the log procedure, the round sequence. She did not make small talk. When I asked questions, she answered them directly and without elaboration. When I did not ask questions, she did not fill the silence. I found this either admirable or unsettling, depending on the hour. What I noticed about Rin in those first nights, and I noticed it before I understood why it mattered, was that she cared about the patients in a way she had built a very specific structure around. She did not linger in rooms. She did not chat with the ones who were alert enough to chat. She did not use diminutives or the soft voice that some nurses use, the one that is meant to comfort but sometimes comes across as practiced. She was efficient and she was correct and she was gone. But when Mr. Casson in 307 had a bad night, and he had them, the nights where he was not quite asleep but not quite present either, calling out in a low voice for things or people that were not there, I watched Rin at the station during those stretches and I saw what she did with her hands. She put them flat on the desk, both of them, and she sat very still, and she did not go to him. At the time I read that as discipline, professional detachment, the kind you develop after enough years in long-term care, where attachment is a thing that costs you. I thought she had learned not to go to him because going to him did not help him, and she knew that and had accepted it. I thought the stillness was the absence of feeling. I was wrong about that. The stillness was the containment of it. There's a difference, and I did not know enough about Rin yet to see it. She had been there 11 years. Casson had been there 7. She knew his name for her. Not Rin. Something else. Something he had decided to call her in the way that long-term patients sometimes rename the people who care for them when the original name stops feeling like enough. She never told me what it was. I found out later. The rules were on a laminated card zip-tied to the inside cover of the blue binder at the nurse's station. I found them on my second night, during the orientation handoff, when Rin slid the binder across the desk toward me and told me to read the inside cover before I read anything else. The card was not old. The lamination was recent, the kind you get at a FedEx office, clean edges, no yellowing. But the text beneath the lamination looked like it had been retyped from something older. The font was slightly uneven in places, the spacing between lines not quite consistent. The way text looks when someone has transcribed it carefully from a source that was damaged or faded and tried to get every word right. The corners of the card were soft. One edge had lifted slightly from the laminate, just enough to catch your fingernail if you ran it along the border. I read it. Rin sat across from me with her hands flat on the desk and watched me read it. She did not explain it before I read it, and she did not speak while I read it. The card had 6 rules. They were numbered. They were written in plain language. Not clinical language, not policy language, the kind of plain language a person uses when they want to be understood clearly and do not have time for ambiguity. I read all 6. Then I looked up at Ren. She looked back at me. I said, "Is this a hazing thing?" She said, "No." I looked back at the card. My first read of it had been quick, scanning for the shape of the thing, the way you read a post-it notice before deciding whether it applies to you. My second read was slower. I went rule by rule. The rational explanations came easily because I had been in healthcare long enough to know that strange-looking protocols almost always have mundane origins. A patient wandered once, and someone wrote a rule. A family complained once, and someone wrote a rule. A nurse made a judgment call that turned out wrong, and someone wrote a rule. Institutions accrete rules the way old buildings accrete layers of paint, each one covering something that happened, none of them explaining what. I told myself, liability. I told myself, the previous night's supervisor was particular. I told myself, Pruitt probably added half of these after some incident he didn't want documented properly. These were all things I believed when I first read the card. Some of them I believed for longer than I should have. The one that bothered me most on that first read, the one I kept returning to even while I was still rationalizing, was Rule 1. Not because it was the strangest, because it was the one I almost understood, and almost understanding something is worse than not understanding it at all. It sits in your head and turns. Ren watched me finish. I set the card down. She slid it back under the zip tie without looking at it. She had not needed to read it. She already knew what it said. Rule 1 said, if a patient in room 304, 306, or 308 asks you what time it is between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., tell them it is earlier than it is. Never by more than 2 hours. Never by less than 1. I read that 1 3 times. The rational explanation I landed on was psych protocol. There's real research on time disorientation in elderly patients. On the way, knowing the correct time in the middle of the night can spike anxiety and disrupt the sleep cycle, on how a small, benign misdirection can keep a patient calm through a window where calm matters. It was not a huge stretch. It was the kind of rule a careful doctor might put in place for a specific patient population and then never bothered to annotate with a reason, because the reason seemed obvious to him and he did not anticipate having to explain it to anyone. I accepted that. I moved on to Rule 2. Rule 2 said, at the start of each shift, initial the intake log for all 6 patients before entering any room. If you cannot account for all 6 signatures by 10:15 p.m., call the number on the inside cover of this binder. Do not begin rounds. That one I read as liability. Confirm all patients present before beginning care. Standard enough in structure, slightly unusual in the specificity of the time. 10:15, not 10:30, not within the first half hour, but I filed that under the previous supervisor was particular and kept going. Rule 3 said, the east corridor light at the far end will sometimes turn itself off. Do not replace the bulb. Do not reset the switch. Finish your round using your pen light and return to the front desk. Log that the light was off in the time. Nothing else. I almost laughed at that one. Almost. The electrical explanation was obvious. Old building, old wiring, a circuit that tripped under certain conditions. The instruction not to replace the bulb read as either a maintenance jurisdiction thing or the remnant of some internal dispute about who was responsible for what. I had worked in enough old buildings to know that facility politics produced stranger rules than this. I kept going. Rule 4 said, do not enter any patient room between 3 a.m. and 3:20 a.m. for any reason, including alarms, calls, or sounds. If a monitor alarm triggers during that window, silence it from the station panel. Chart it as equipment variance. If a patient calls out, do not answer. The window closes at 3:20. You may enter at 3:21. That one I did not almost laugh at. That one I read twice and sat down and looked at Ren and said, this one's a problem. If a patient is in distress at 3 a.m., I am not sitting at the desk. Ren said, you will. I said, that's not how I work. She said, it will be. She did not say it like a threat. She said it the way someone tells you the road ahead is wet. A condition, not a warning. I put the car down and told myself I would follow the rules that made sense and use my judgment on the ones that didn't. I believed that for about 4 days. Rule 5 said, Mr. Casson in room 307 will sometimes be sitting up when you arrive for rounds. He should be lying down. Do not touch him to reposition him. Speak his name twice, normal volume. If he does not respond by the second call, complete the rest of your round and return him last. He will be lying down by then. The use of Casson's name, a specific patient, a specific room number, stopped me. The other rules were general. This one was written for one person. I asked Ren about it. I asked her what his condition was, whether the sitting up was a known behavior, whether there was a clinical note somewhere that explained the no-touch instruction. She looked at me for a moment before she answered, both hands flat on the desk. She said, "It works." That was all. I wrote it off as a behavioral protocol for a patient with a history I hadn't reviewed yet, and told myself I would pull his chart later. I did pull his chart later. His chart did not explain the rule. Rule 6 said, if at any point the count of patients on this floor is not 6, do not move. Do not use your radio. Do not turn on additional lights. Sit down where you are and wait. When the count returns to 6, complete your round from the beginning. I read that one and did not name what I felt. I folded it up and put it somewhere small and told myself, old building, eccentric management, probably nothing. 6 rules on a laminated card. I had seen stranger things posted in break rooms. I clipped my pen light to my chest pocket and started my first round. The first real shift settled into its rhythm fast. That is the thing about night work and long-term care that people who have not done it do not understand. The routine becomes load-bearing very quickly. You do the same things in the same order at the same times, and the order matters not because anything goes wrong if you change it, but because the order is the thing that keeps you functional at 3 a.m. when your body has stopped believing in the concept of being awake. You build the routine, and then you let the routine carry you. That is the job. 10 p.m., arrive, key card, elevator, the low shift in the shaft. Initial the log. All 6 patients present. All 6 signatures in by 10:09. Ren already at the station, hands flat, the chair not leaning yet because she had not sat back. First round at 10:30. Room 301 through 306 on the left side, 302 through 308 on the right. Station at the midpoint, fire door at the end. I moved quietly. Pen light on. The green tile reflecting the beam back up at me in long, thin lines. Each room, door open 2 inches, listen first, then enter, then vitals, then log, then out. The patients were mostly still. Room 303 had a monitor that beeped once every 4 minutes at a slightly higher pitch than the others. Not an alarm, just a calibration variance. Ren had told me, and I clocked it on the first pass and noted the time and moved on. Casson in 307 was asleep on the first round, lying flat, blanket straight across his chest, both hands at his sides. He was a small man, 70s, with the specific stillness of someone whose body had decided that movement was no longer a priority. His monitor was steady. I checked his line, wrote his vitals, and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I needed to. Not because anything was wrong, because the room had a quality I could not name until much later. Not temperature, not smell, not sound. The nearest I can get to it now is this. It was the quality of a room that has been listened to for a long time by something that is very patient. The east corridor on that first full round, all 4 lights on. The mineral smell faint at the far end, present but not strong. The way a smell is when the thing producing it is not close. I walked to the fire door, checked the latch, turned back. And then, without deciding to, without any particular reason, I counted the wall panels on the left side. 8. The same number I had counted on my orientation walk. I noted it the way I note most things automatically, and then I took out the small notepad I keep in my right scrub pocket and wrote, East Hall, left side, 8 panels. I did not write why. I did not know why. I put the notepad away and walked back to the station and wrote the round time in the log and sat down in the leaning chair and waited for midnight vitals. The hours between midnight and 3 a.m. on a quiet long-term care floor have a specific texture. Not peaceful exactly. Peaceful implies the absence of something, and this was more like the presence of a very particular kind of stillness, the stillness of 6 people breathing in separate rooms, of monitors cycling through their readouts, of a building doing what old buildings do at night when no one is asking anything of them. Rin moved through it like she was part of it. She did her rounds without the pen light. She knew the corridor well enough to navigate by the ambient light from the monitor screens and the faint glow under the patient room doors. I watched her go and come back twice before I stopped watching and focused on my own work. We did not talk much. This was not uncomfortable. Some people fill silence because silence makes them nervous, and some people leave silence alone because they have learned it is not a problem that needs solving. Ren was the second kind. I was learning to be. At 1:45 a.m., she made 2 cups of coffee in the small machine behind the station and set one in front of me without asking if I wanted it. I took it. It was not good coffee. I drank it anyway. She sat down, both hands flat, and looked at the corridor and did not say anything. I looked at the corridor too. The far light was on. The tile was wet-looking and still. Somewhere in 305, a monitor beeped once and stopped. Everything was exactly as it should be. I finished the coffee and started the 2 a.m. round, and the floor was wet-looking and still, and the far light was on, and everything was exactly where it should be. The first time Rule 5 activated, it was 1:17 a.m. on my 4th shift. I came around the corner into the right side corridor and put my pen light on room 307 through the 2-inch gap in the door, and Cassin was sitting up. Not the way a person sits up when they have woken naturally. Not adjusting, not reaching for water, not looking toward the door. Sitting up the way a thing sits up when it has been placed in that position. Straight, both hands in his lap, his face toward the window, which looked out onto the side street, and the broken lamp and nothing in particular. His monitor was steady. His vitals, from what I could read without entering, looked normal. He was breathing. He was simply sitting up in the specific way the rule had described, and the rule had described it correctly, and that was the part that sat wrong. I stood in the doorway. I said his name. Normal volume, the way you'd say it to someone you thought might be asleep but weren't sure. Mr. Cassin. He did not move. I said it again. Mr. Cassin. The second one landed in the room and stayed there, and he did not respond to it in any way. Not a shift, not a change in breathing, not the small muscular adjustment a sleeping person makes when a sound reaches them. Nothing. I stood there for 3 seconds. Then I remembered the rule. I pulled the door back to 2 inches and finished the rest of the round. Rooms 308, 302, 304, 306, 301, 303. I did them all in order, wrote the vitals, wrote the times, kept moving. The physical routine of it helped. This is what the routine is for, I think, in situations like that. Not efficiency, but the grounding effect of having the next thing already decided. I did not have to think about what to do next because the round told me what to do next, and so I did it, and the part of my brain that wanted to think about Cassin sitting up in the dark with his face toward the window had to wait. I came back to 307 last. I put my pen light on the gap. Cassin was lying down, blanket straight across his chest, both hands at his sides, eyes closed. His breathing was the same slow rhythm it had been every other night. The room was exactly as it should be. Same temperature, same monitor readout, same quality of stillness. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and then I went in and checked his line and wrote his vitals, and they were fine. Everything was fine. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, and then I went back to the station. Ren was at the desk. I sat down and wrote the round time, and then I told her what happened. I told her about the sitting up, the 2 calls, the no response, coming back to find him lying down. I told it factually, the way I would recount any clinical observation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the log, and then she looked at me. She said, "Good." 1 word. I waited for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. She looked back at the monitor screens, and I sat with the word good and tried to work out what it was doing there. Good that I followed the rule. Good that he was lying down when I returned. Good that I came back at all. Maybe. I did not know which one she meant, and I did not ask because something told me. Not instinct, just the accumulated read of 11 days working alongside this woman. That asking would produce another single word that would answer my question technically and explain nothing. I rationalized it on the drive home. Cassin had a neurological condition that produced episodes of motoric rigidity. I had seen something like it before in a different patient years ago. a man whose body would lock into positions during partial consciousness states and release on its own without intervention. The no-touch instruction made sense in that context. The two-name call was a standard verbal stimulus protocol. The fact that the rule described it so precisely just meant someone had observed the pattern and written it down, which was good nursing, which was what you were supposed to do. By the time I parked on the side street under the broken lamp, I had assembled a complete and reasonable explanation, and I almost believed all of it. What I could not explain, and did not try to, was the blanket. The way it was positioned when I came back, straight across his chest, both hands at his sides, was identical to how it had been positioned at the start of the round. Not similar. Identical. I know the difference between a patient who has resettled himself and a patient who has been reset. I did not write that in the log. I went home and slept 4 hours and did not dream and got up and went back. The East Corridor light went out at 2:41 a.m. on my 9th shift. I was halfway through the round, coming out of 306 when the far end of the corridor went dark. Not a flicker, not a gradual dim. Off, the way a light goes off when someone throws a switch. Immediate, complete, the 30 feet between the last room and the fire door dropping from pale green reflection to nothing. I stood in the corridor and looked at it. The 3 remaining lights behind me were still on. The station glow reached maybe 10 feet past the midpoint. Beyond that, dark, and the fire door at the end of it, and the ventilation panel on the right side wall, and the mineral smell coming up stronger now, the way a smell gets when the temperature around it changes. I took out my pen light. Rule 3 was very clear, and I had read it enough times that it did not require retrieval. Finish your round using your pen light, return to the front desk, log the light and the time, nothing else. I had 2 rooms left on the east end. 307 and 308, both on the right side, both between me and the fire door. I clipped the pen light to my chest and started walking. 307 first. Cassin, lying flat, vitals steady, blanket straight. Fine. I came out and moved to 308. The smell was stronger here. Not unpleasant exactly, mineral and faintly cold, the way the air smells near a stone surface in winter. I went in, checked the patient, wrote the vitals, came back out into the corridor. I turned toward the fire door to check the latch the way I did at the end of every round, and that is when I saw it. Low, maybe 4 feet off the ground. At the far end of the corridor between the ventilation panel and the fire door, in the space where the last light would have been if the last light had been on. My pen light reached it, just barely, the edge of the beam, enough to define a shape without defining it fully. Pale, not white. Pale the way something is pale when the color has been taken out of it rather than never having been there. It was not standing. It was not quite crouching. It was occupying the space the way water occupies a container, filling the available shape of the darkness rather than holding a shape of its own. The way Cassin was still when he was sitting up. The positioned kind of still. My pen light was on it, and it did not react to the light. It did not move away from it or toward it. It was simply there at the end of the corridor between me and the fire door, and I was standing 8 feet away from it with my pen light, making a small circle of visibility around me and 30 feet of green tile between me and the station behind me. My right hand moved. Not a decision. My hand moved to the wall beside me and found the door frame of 308 and held it. Both feet stayed where they were. I did not move toward it. I did not move away from it. I stood there and I counted, without meaning, to 1, 2, 3 for the ceiling panels above me, which is a useless thing to do and the only thing my brain would produce. I walked backward, 1 step, then another, keeping the pen light forward, keeping the beam on the space at the end of the corridor. It did not follow. It did not shift. It stayed where it was, and I stayed in the beam of my own light, and I backed up the full length of the corridor to the station without turning around and sat down in the leaning chair and put both hands flat on the desk the way Ren did and sat there for a moment that I did not time. Then I wrote in the log, East Corridor light off, 2:41 a.m. Nothing else. Rule 3, exactly as written. Ren came back from her own round 2 minutes later. She looked at the log entry. She looked at me. She asked 1 question. She said, "Did you keep moving?" I said yes. She nodded. She sat down. She did not ask what I saw. She did not offer an explanation. She picked up her coffee and looked at the monitor screens, and the silence between us was a different kind of silence than it had been before. Not the comfortable silence of two people doing a job, but the silence of two people who are now, without having discussed it, on the same side of something. The rational explanations did not come on the drive home that night. I sat in my car under the broken lamp for 23 minutes, and I did not produce a single one. I counted the cracks in the windshield instead. There were 4. I already knew there were 4. I counted them anyway. It happened on my 14th shift, 3:04 a.m. The 3 a.m. window had come and gone 11 times before that night without incident. I had learned the shape of it, the way the floor changed quality at 3 o'clock, the way the monitors seemed to cycle slightly slower, the way the occupied quiet of 6 patients breathing became a different kind of quiet that I'd stopped trying to name. I silenced the station panel if anything triggered. I wrote equipment variants in the log. I did not go into rooms. I sat in the leaning chair with both hands flat, and I waited for 3:20, and when 3:20 came, I exhaled and started the round, and everything was always exactly as it should be. That night, Casson started calling out at 3:02. Not distress, not the sharp vocalization of a patient in pain. The low, repetitive call of someone in a half-sleep state reaching for something familiar. He did it sometimes outside the window, and the protocol was the same as any other middle-of-the-night vocalization. Log it, monitor it, wait for it to resolve. But at 3:02, it did not resolve. It continued, and at 3:04, he said a name. Not his own name, not a family member's name, as far as I knew, a name I had not heard him use before. I looked at Ren. Her hands were flat on the desk. She was looking at the corridor. Casson called the name again. The same cadence, the same low register, the same reaching quality, and something in Ren's face changed in a way I could not fully read. Not fear, not the absence of it either. Something that had been held in place for a long time, shifting by a very small degree. I said her name. Ren. She did not look at me. Casson called out again. The name again. And I understood then, from the way her hands pressed slightly harder against the desk, from the way her jaw set, I understood that the name he was saying was hers. Not Ren. The other one. The name he had decided to call her at some point in 7 years of her being the person who came to his room every night and checked his line and wrote his vitals and left without lingering. Whatever name that was, he was saying it at 3:06 a.m., and she was sitting 4 feet away from me and not going to him, and the effort of not going to him was the most visible thing I had ever seen her do. At 3:08, she stood up. I said, Ren, it's 3:08. She said, he knows me. She did not take her pen light. I said her name again. Just her name. She was already moving. I watched her walk the corridor. Her footsteps were quiet. She knew the floor, and she did not hesitate at the door. She pushed it open to the width of a person and went in, and the door swung back to 2 inches behind her. Casson stopped calling out. The silence that replaced it was immediate and complete and worse than the calling had been. I looked at the clock. 3:09. I looked at the monitor panel. Casson's readout was steady. All 6 patients steady. I looked at the corridor. The door to 307 was 2 inches open and dark inside, and still. I put both hands flat on the desk, and I sat there, and I did not move, and I did not use the radio, and I did not turn on additional lights because those were the rules for a different situation, but they were the only rules I had, and they were the only thing I could think to follow. 3:15. The door did not open. 3:18. The door did not open. 3:20 came and went. At 3:21, I stood up. I walked the corridor. I pushed the door to 307 open and went in. Casson was asleep, lying flat, blanket straight across his chest, both hands at his sides. His monitor was steady. His vitals were normal. The room was exactly as it should be at 3:21 a.m. on any other night. Ren's penlight was on the floor beside his bed. The clip was still closed. It had not been dropped. It had been set down. Ren was not in the room. Ren was not in the corridor. Ren was not in the supply room or the staff bathroom or anywhere on the 3rd floor that I could find in the next 4 minutes of looking, which was the longest 4 minutes I've spent in my life. Moving through a building at 3:25 a.m., calling a name in a low voice and getting nothing back. I returned to the station. I sat down. I initialed the log for 3:30 a.m. because it was 3:28 and close enough, and my hand needed something to do. I wrote all 6 patient vitals. I wrote Ren's name in the notes column, and then I crossed it out because I did not know what to write after it, and the log did not have a category for what had just happened. I sat in the leaning chair, and it leaned, and I did not correct for it, and I waited for 6 a.m. the way you wait for something when waiting is the only available action, and you have run out of the ability to pretend otherwise. At 4:02 a.m., I did a full count, not because the monitor panel showed anything wrong. All 6 readouts were steady, all 6 patients present on the board. I did it because I needed to do something with my hands and my legs and the part of my brain that had been running the same loop since 3:21 and producing nothing useful. I took my pen light and I started at 3:01 and I went room by room. 3:01, present. 3:02, present. 3:03, present. 3:04, present. 3:05, present. 3:06, present. 3:07, Casson present, lying flat, blanket straight, both hands at his sides, breathing slow and even, the room exactly as it had been at 3:21 when I found his pen light on the floor and Ren not in it. 3:08, present. 8 rooms checked. 6 patients, all present. I came back to the station and looked at the count on the panel. 6. I looked at the log. 6 signatures at shift start, all initialed, all present. I sat down in the chair lean. I put my hands flat on the desk, and I sat there, and I thought about Ren's pen light on the floor with the clip still closed, and I thought about the name Casson had been saying, and I thought about 11 years, and I thought about the way she had said he knows me like it was a reason that outweighed everything else, and I sat with all of that and could not make it anything with edges. Then the count on the panel changed. Not an alarm. The monitors did not alarm. The number on the panel changed, 6 patients to 5. The way a display changes when a value updates, clean and immediate and without any of the sounds that are supposed to accompany that kind of change. Room 307. Casson's readout did not flatline. It did not show a critical value. It simply went to a gray state, the state the monitors go to when they lose connection to a sensor, and the patient count on the panel dropped to 5. I stood up. I started toward the corridor. I got 4 steps. Then I remembered Rule 6. I stopped. I stood in the middle of the corridor, for steps from the station, equidistant from nothing in particular, and I thought about the rule. Do not move. Do not use your radio. Do not turn on additional lights. Sit down where you are and wait. I was not sitting. I was standing 4 steps into the corridor at 4:08 a.m. with a gray readout on the panel behind me and 30 feet of green tile in front of me and the east corridor beyond that and the far light. I checked. The far light was off. I sat down on the floor, right there for steps from the station, cross-legged on the green tile that looked wet and was not. I turned my pen light off. I put both hands on my knees. I waited. The corridor was not silent. It had never been fully silent. The monitors, the building, the specific respiration, sounds of 6 patients in 6 rooms. Now, it was 5 patients and 1 gray readout, and a building doing what old buildings do at 4 a.m., and me on the floor in the middle of it. I counted the ceiling panels above me. 12 from where I was sitting. I could see 12 of the 14 in the main corridor. I counted them again. 12. I looked toward the east corridor. I could not see the panels on the east corridor wall from where I was sitting. I knew they were there. I had counted them 9 nights running. 8 panels, left side, floor to ceiling, beadboard wainscoting, evenly spaced. I had written it in my notepad on the first night. East hall, left side, 8 panels. I had counted them again on the 3rd night, and the 5th night, and the 8th night. 8. Always 8. I knew it the way I knew my mother counted backsplash tiles when she was anxious, waiting for water to boil. I knew it the way I'd been counting things since I was a child without understanding that what I was counting was always the same thing. The number of ordinary facts standing between me and whatever I was afraid of. I sat on the floor, and I did not move toward the east corridor, and I did not turn on additional lights, and I did not use my radio, and I counted the 12 visible ceiling panels above me one more time, and I waited. At 4:11, the panel behind me made a sound, a soft click, the sound of a connection re-establishing, and Casson's readout came back. The count returned to 6. I stood up. My legs had gone partly numb from the tile. I stood up anyway, and I went back to the station, and I looked at the panel. 6 patients, all steady, Cassin's readout green and normal, vitals within his usual range. And then I picked up my pen light, and I started the round from the beginning the way Rule 6 said to. 301 through 308, every room, every vital, every log entry. When I reached the east corridor, I turned my pen light on, and I walked it the way I had walked it every other night. I counted the panels on the left side as I walked. 9. I stopped. I was at the midpoint of the east corridor for panels behind me, and 5 ahead, and the count was 9. I counted again from the beginning, touching each panel lightly with my left hand as I passed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 panels. The same wainscoting, the same beadboard, the same finish. But 9. One more than there had been on every prior night. The additional panel was the 3rd from the fire door. It looked identical to the others in my penlight beam. Same finish, same spacing, same height. But the grout lines around it were darker than the others. Almost black, the way the floor grout was at the far end of the corridor. And it was slightly warmer than the panels on either side of it. Not hot, warm. The specific warmth of a surface that has something behind it. I thought about the logbook entry I'd found on my first night. 7, 440E. I had read that as a typo. I had read it as a typo for a long time. I took my hand off it. I turned back toward the station. I did not touch it again. I did not knock on it. I did not look for a seam or an edge or a way to open it. I walked back to the station and I sat down and I wrote in the log, East Corridor light off for 08 a.m. and nothing else. I initialed the entry. I checked the time. It was 4:44 a.m. I had 1 hour and 16 minutes until the end of the shift. I kept both hands flat on the desk, and I watched the monitor panel, and I counted the panels above the station. 14, the same as always, and I did not move from that chair until 6 a.m. came and the day shift nurse pushed the elevator button downstairs, and I heard the low shift in the shaft that meant someone was coming up, and I was still there, and the count was still 6, and I had made it to morning. I left the log on the desk with all entries completed and my end-of-shift signature at the bottom. I did not write anything in the notes column. The day shift nurse, a man named Terrell who I had met twice during handoffs, and who had the specific cheerfulness of someone who worked days and had never had reason to lose it, came off the elevator at 6:02 and said good morning, and I said good morning back, and I gave him the handoff in the same words I used every morning. 6 patients, all stable. No incidents to report. He nodded and sat down, and the chair leaned, and he corrected for it automatically the way you do when you know a chair, and I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. The elevator made its sound. I wrote it down. The lobby was empty, the reception desk unmanned, the 2 chairs by the door holding nobody. I pushed through the front entrance, and the October air was cold in the specific way Chicago air is cold at 6 in the morning. Not the cold of night, which is still and settled, but the cold of early morning, which has movement in it, which is going somewhere. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The brick of the building was dark behind me. I did not look at the 3rd floor windows. I walked to my car. I drove to the 7-Eleven on Milwaukee Avenue. I parked in a lot. I went inside and bought a large coffee, the kind in the paper cup with the cardboard sleeve, and I brought it back to the car and I sat in the driver's seat and I did not drink it. I held it with both hands, and I let it be warm against my palms, and I sat there for 40 minutes while the sky went from dark gray to light gray to the specific pale blue of a Chicago morning in October that means the sun is up somewhere behind the cloud cover, even if you cannot see it. At some point, I took out my phone and called my brother. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the specific texture of someone pulled from sleep but trying not to show it. I did not tell him where I had been or what had happened. I said, hey. He said, hey, you okay? I said, yeah, just calling. He said, it's 6:40 in the morning. I said, I know. He said, okay, and waited, and I listened to him breathe for a moment, and then I said I'd call him later and hung up. I drove home. I parked in my spot. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, and I counted them. 14, same as always, and I went inside, and I lay down on my bed without taking off my scrubs, and I slept for 3 hours, and when I woke up the coffee was still in my car getting cold, and the ceiling above my bed had 22 tiles, and I counted them twice before I got up. I did not go back to Harrowfield. I called Pruitt that afternoon and told him I was resigning, effective immediately, and that he could mail my final check. He did not ask why. He said okay in the tone of a man who had received this call before and had stopped being surprised by it. I said one thing before I hung up. I asked him how long the rules had been posted in the binder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "As long as I've been here." I asked how long that was. He said a while. I said okay and hung up, and I have not spoken to him since. That was 7 months ago. I work days now, a clinic in Pilsen, walk-in hours, the ordinary procession of ordinary complaints, ear infections, sprains, prescription refills, the specific exhaustion of people who have been putting off coming in for longer than they should have. I am good at the work. I have always been good at the work. I wash my hands, and I check the charts, and I write the times, and I go home at 6 p.m. while it is still light out, and I do not think about the East Corridor every day anymore. Most days, I still count things. More than before, if I'm being straight about it. I count the ceiling tiles in every room I spend more than 5 minutes in. I count the steps between my car and any building entrance. I count the panels on walls and corridors, especially long ones, especially ones with a light out at the far end. I do not go into corridors with a light out at the far end if I can avoid it. I cannot always avoid it. When I cannot, I count what I can see, and I keep moving, and I do not stop, and I do not look too long at anything that is the wrong temperature. I do not visit people in long-term care facilities anymore. When a friend's father was admitted to a place in Evanston last spring, I sent flowers and called from the parking lot and said I was not feeling well. I was not lying exactly. I just could not walk that kind of corridor again, and I have stopped pretending I will be able to someday, soon. The 4 bag I did not catch at Northwestern sits differently in me now. The guilt is still there. I want to be clear about that. It did not go away, and I did not trade it for something worse and come out even. It is still there. It is just next to something larger now, something that has given it a different kind of proportion. I'm still the nurse who walked past that bag. I'm also the nurse who sat down on a cold tile floor at 4:08 a.m. and waited and did not move toward the thing that had the wrong count and came out the other side of the shift. Both of those things are true at the same time. If you're listening to this and you find yourself, for whatever reason, working a night shift in a place with rules you do not understand, read them. Read them the way someone wrote them, which is carefully and under conditions you do not want to know about. Follow the ones that seem absurd first, because those are the ones written by someone who learned the hard way that they were not absurd. If the count is wrong, sit down. Do not move toward it. Do not turn on more lights. Do not try to find what is missing. The count will come back, or will not, but moving toward it has never once helped anyone, and I know that now the way I know the number of steps between my car and any door I walk through. I know it because I counted, and I sat still, and I am here, and Ren Okafor is not. And she knew the rules better than anyone, and she broke one anyway. And I think about that every night when the lights go out and the building gets quiet, and something that used to feel like silence stops feeling like silence and starts feeling like something else entirely. Read the rules. Follow them. And if someone who has been there longer than you puts both hands flat on the desk and goes very still, pay attention to that. They're not being dramatic. They're doing the only thing that has ever worked.